Okay, here we are with the first video for Unit 7 about cities and urban land use. And we're starting off with a really cool picture, one of the pictures that Spatial Shark actually took when I was in Kuala Lumpur. This is the very, very famous Petronas Towers, the tallest twin tower still in the world. And when they were built, 1,483 feet tall, they were the tallest building in the world until they were eclipsed by Taipei 101 in Taiwan. I've actually been in this building. The bridge is kind of cool. It's one of the features that most everybody remembers. And it's hard to believe, but that bridge is actually 41 and 42 stories up. These are 88-story towers, but because of the land that they're built on being uneven, the bridge connects to one floor on the 42nd, on the other tower on the 41st. And the bridge is designed to slide in and out of the two towers. So it's really kind of cool, the engineering marvel that had to go into constructing this. But remember, tall buildings are always going to be a sign of GDP. Tall buildings are always going to be a sign of development. Tall buildings are always going to be a sign that a country has really modernized and industrialized and urbanized. And certainly that's the case with Malaysia in Southeast Asia. So as we move through here, we're going to start with a historical analysis. What do we know about urbanization? We know that it hasn't been around all that long. First of all, most humans were hunting and gathering for the longest time. Only about 10,000 years ago did we start farming with sedentary agriculture. With that kind of intensive agricultural practices, people began to be able to live in one area. And because they could live in one area, they started to build urban places. You might want to find a really cool video on YouTube. It's called Why Cities Exist. We saw just the first few minutes of it, but if you want to watch the rest of it, it gives you a great background about the historical origin of urbanization. And of course, we know that MDCs, more developed countries, tend to be more urban. Less developed countries tend to be more rural. In fact, we can use the rate of urbanization to predict the level of development. So I just gave you some interesting kind of regional breakdowns here about places that are more and less urban. And you can also see then that they are more and less developed as well, just by the color coding. So what do we know about the ancient world? Cities in the ancient world were, certainly not like today. Nowhere near the population numbers that we see. Athens in the Greek time period might have been 30,000 people. When we start thinking about the big cities of today in the millions and in the tens and 20s of millions, nothing like that in the ancient world. Of course, you know that global population was a lot less. But one thing about cities is that it developed what we call a leadership class or an urban elite, social stratification. It was not egalitarian like the hunter-gatherer societies. And as soon as you start to have leadership people, you're going to start to develop political expression. And so the first of these kind of governments were the city-states. And don't think of those as being Greek first, because there were other examples of city-states throughout the ancient world. But we also know that cities are always centers of trade. The early cities would have been chosen because of site characteristics. Later on, cities are going to start to develop because of situational characteristics. Some places are because of the religious shrines that are there and the pilgrimages that people make. Centers of trade, centers of politics, centers of society, centers of culture. And please understand that a lot of this is happening simultaneously. Sometimes when you take a world history class, you get the idea that all these things are happening in a vacuum. They didn't necessarily have a lot of contact with each other. There's a lot of independent invention going on, but there is overlap in terms of where these places were in the world and how the urbanization was occurring at different places and at different times. So, of course, the Greeks and the Romans in Western culture become important. Not that there weren't ancient cities in India and China, and certainly there were Mesopotamia and Egypt, but we focus more on the Greek and the Roman cities in this sense because a lot of European cities of today are based on cities that were built originally by the Greeks and the Romans. Londinium, right, originally by the Romans. You have a lot of cities in the Mediterranean world that were originally settled by the Greeks before the Romans took over. So when we think about these cities, and this is an overhead view of the Acropolis in Athens, These ancient cities weren't necessarily clean. They had all kinds of sanitation problems, disease problems, plagues would come and go. But this was, again, a city that had a place for trade, the agora, the marketplace, where people would meet and exchange ideas. All of this happens. And again, even today, agoraphobia, fear of public places. But the Greeks developed this idea of the polis, the city state. And the density was very high. And you can see, even from this picture today, the density is still very, very high in urban places. Well, this idea diffused out to the Romans. And then you go and you find places where the Roman world kind of becomes transformed by technology. The Romans perfected the arch. They used concrete. Many Roman buildings are still standing, and indeed they're still functioning in Western Europe. Whether they're aqueducts that bring water in from far away, bridges that were originally built by the Romans, even things like Colosseums. And remember, the one in Rome, it's called the Colosseum not because of the stadium, it's because of the Colossus statue that was outside. And the one in Rome is certainly more famous because of its great size, but there are better, more preserved Colosseums throughout the Western European world. One, in fact, is in a place called Nîmes. If you ever get into southern France in the area of Provence, you can go find one of the most perfectly preserved stadiums. And we also sometimes call them, arena. An arena, it's reference to the sand that was on the wood floor, because as the gladiators would spill their blood, the floor would get slippery. So they would throw sand on the floor, and arena is sand. So when we get these words in our English language, a lot of times it comes to us from the ancient world. And in this case, Romans certainly knew how to be prolific city builders. Well, what happens after that is you go into the medieval period. When Rome falls, you get a decentralization of political power, and every city kind of becomes governed by its own nobility. And of course, it was a very pastoral, agricultural kind of a society with walled cities to protect against outsiders and invaders. This is a city in France called Carcassonne. Carcassonne is a fantastic place to visit. It's almost like you go through a time warp to go back into the city. We took students there on one of our spring break trips, and you can just get lost walking in this maze of shops and little guild type, people making shoes or sword blades, and skilled craftsmen. It's just an amazing kind of like an entire society into itself. The environmental conditions, of course, were such that people living in cities was, again, still dangerous because of disease, because of lack of sanitation. With the Industrial Revolution, you get the black towns, especially in the Midlands of England, where because of burning coal, you had air quality issues. And then, of course, throughout the post-war European cities, especially in Eastern Europe, you get these kind of dystopian, kind of like really stark, bleak block housing, where everybody is, kind of, in the same apartment. It's the cookie cutter design, and there's certainly no creativity and certainly nothing appealing by visual sense. You can still see the old city, and you see the church spires and the town halls and things like that. And in a lot of European cities, the law is that no building can be taller than the churches. So a lot of times when you do see tall buildings in European cities, they're far out from the city center. They've built a new downtown. Paris is a great example of that. If you're standing on top of the Arc de Triomphe, you look one way at the Champs-Élysées and you see old France, the classical buildings of Van Haussmann from the period of the 1800s. But if you turn around and look the other direction, you're looking down the Avenue of the Grande Armée, and you see out to La Défense, which is where all the big modern glass and steel skyscrapers are. If you are coming with Spatial Shark on this year's trip, we will go to Paris. We will go up into the Arc de Triomphe, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So we also need to talk about the rank size rule. In nature, we see that there are all of these sequential relationships where, dolphin frequency patterns or, the patterns of incomes, you see this mathematical formula where the nth city is going to be 1/nth the size of the largest city. So it's this inversely proportional, almost like a Fibonacci sequence, where, the rank of the city is proportional to its population compared to the largest city. In the United States, we have, for example, New York City. Los Angeles being second and being about half the population. Chicago being third and about 1/3 the population of New York. Houston being fourth and it being about a quarter. Phoenix being fifth and being about 1/5 of New York's population. And Germany is like this as well. But when you look at some countries, they don't have this zip rank size rule because of the presence of a primate city, all right? Because the cities have to be in proportion to fit the rank size rule. So one of the words we're going to learn when we talk about primate cities is that the city is disproportionately large. But if you look at a lot of countries and if you observe their population characteristics, you'll see that there is this rank size rule that is in play. And this has been on the AP exam as an essay question. They gave Mexico as the example, and I'll let you start to think about, does Mexico City fit the rank size rule? It is a primate city. Mexico City is over 30 million. It's about 1/4 of Mexico's entire population, so disproportionately large. Remember, when we have a primate city, we don't have a rank size rule. Remember that primate cities can be great when people want to move there and get ahead and get job opportunities. So the drawback, though, for a primate city is that usually it means that all development or all opportunity is going to be in that primate city. So if you live in a country with a primate city, like Egypt with Cairo, like Nigeria with Lagos, like Peru with Lima, if you don't live in the capital city, if you don't live in the big primate city, maybe you don't have opportunities. And this is what creates this kind of perceived rural to urban migratory push and pull where, these primate cities continue to just become explosively large with size. And in cases where, there aren't opportunities, people show up and there's no plan for them. This is where we sometimes get the development of slums that we'll talk about much later in the slideshow. Okay, that'll do it for slideshow number 1. Hopefully I'll try and get back with another slideshow for you for the weekend, but this will get you off to a decent start. Talk soon.